The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in debate today on Bill C-30. Earlier this week, I'm in Winnipeg now. I was in Ottawa as recently as this morning. For the first time in the 10 years that I've lived here, there was a couple of seniors that set up camp here in Transcona and Park Circle, where we have our cenotaph. And Main Street Project has since visited, and they've moved on from the park. And I can certainly appreciate the concern that residents had and why they may not want somebody living in the park across the street from their house. But I couldn't find it in my heart to be angry, because these are a couple of seniors who don't have any place to live anymore. And we heard stories like this. We've been hearing more and more of them. People are seeing in their communities the effect of higher prices, and particularly higher housing prices, on people in their community. Folks that are camping out in bus shelters because they have nowhere else to turn. And so we're in this really challenging moment, challenging to be sure for the Canadians that are experiencing this directly and don't have a place to sleep, challenging also for Canadians who are now seeing people living in their communities in ways that they had never imagined people would, and wondering what that means for those folks, but also for themselves and for their safety. Because we know that when people are desperate, that sometimes that results in some really unfortunate behavior that has an effect on the wider community. And so people are experiencing this moment that we're in all sorts of ways. At the grocery store, there are folks that are putting things back on the shelf or changing what they buy, trying to change some of their family's habits in order to conform better to the realities of budgeting in this inflationary period that we're experiencing. Because even though from a public health point of view, we're moving further and further away from the peak pandemic point, the fact of the matter is that our economy is still very much affected by the pandemic. We haven't come back yet. And that's one of the reasons that people need help. And so there's been a lot of debate in this place. Members will know, and Canadians that have been listening to the news will know, there's been a lot of debate in this place about this moment of inflation and what the causes are. Well, there was a good article published by some economists recently that essentially say that the main forces of inflation are energy prices, housing prices, and grocery prices. And that's, and when you think about the role that energy and housing and food play in our life, you can imagine that if those are the things that are going up in price, that people really feel that in their budget. And there's no real alternative. You can't choose not to have a roof over your head. You can end up in a situation where you don't have a roof over your head, but nobody is choosing to live on the street as a first option. You can't choose not to eat, and you can't choose not to heat your home if you're lucky enough to have one in the winter months in Canada. And so that's why people are feeling the squeeze, because the cost of the things that we cannot do without continue to rise. And there are those in this place, particularly the new leader of the Conservative Party, that would have everyone believe that somehow this is simply the fault of big spending governments. And that if government would just get out of the way, the free market would step in and provide housing for the homeless and provide affordable food for those who need it and can't pay for it, or provide energy at a fairer price. But I would call on Canadians to think hard about that line and the bill of goods that's trying to be sold to them by this new leader of the Conservative Party. We all know that oil and gas companies haven't had the best interests of consumers at heart for a long time. That's not a newsflash. Anybody who ever filled up their car to go out to the lake on a long weekend knows that oil and gas companies have been there to gouge Canadians for every possible excuse. And there's actually some real challenging reasons out there in the world right now, like Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is just one that has caused some real supply issues in the oil and gas sector. And you can bet they use that as an excuse to raise their prices. Not because the gas that's currently in the tanks of gas stations got any more expensive or that they had to retroactively pay a premium for it, but this is all part of the speculation about future oil and gas markets. Really, it's just an opportunity to make more money now. And we're seeing that in the bottom line of oil and gas companies that are logging record profit. Not just record revenue, record profit. That means what they're taking home and giving to their rich CEOs and their investors and their board members is more, much more than it's ever been. And they're making that money. That money's not falling from the sky. That money's not coming from nowhere either. That money is coming directly out of the pockets of Canadians who have to pay for gas at the pump to get to work, to do the things that they need to do in their life, or to heat their home. And in other jurisdictions, what we're seeing is governments that are willing to act. We see in the United Kingdom that there's a windfall profit tax levied on oil and gas companies in order to take back some of that additional profit that those companies are making in these difficult circumstances to invest back in people. That's just one example of a jurisdiction that recognizes that what's going on is not simply government largesse driving inflation, but that corporate greed is playing a real role in driving that as well. And that those profits that are being logged are coming out of the pockets of citizens and can be taken back to be reinvested in citizens, as we must do if we're going to keep our communities safe and we're going to keep our neighbors housed and we're going to make sure that kids have a proper breakfast and lunch when they go to school so that they can learn what they need to learn to become productive members of society and to enrich their own lives in all the ways that a good education will do. So, that's one example. We don't hear outrage from the Conservative leader about that extra profit on the part of oil and gas companies. We don't hear him admonishing those companies for taking this moment as an opportunity to pad their pockets. When we think about housing, which is another major driver of inflation right now, the new leader of the Conservative Party would have you believe that somehow this problem was created in the last 2 years. That somehow the liquidity that the government made available to banks, and I would say, because often it sounds like, people talk about pandemic benefits and how they should have been wrapped up and how that was driving inflation. People who normally might have made $4,000 or $5,000 a month were living on $2,000, and we're supposed to believe that that was inflationary. I think it's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. I've said that many times in this place. I will continue to say that. If there's anything that actually caused inflationary pressure in terms of the government spending package, I've mentioned, two things. One, and this one drives me nuts too, Mr. Speaker, the wage subsidy program, where we know that many companies benefited from the wage subsidy and made extraordinary profits at the same time, which is something that never ought to have happened. They shouldn't have been allowed to take from the wage subsidy pot while they were logging huge profits. And there should have been a mechanism for paying some of that back if they were making extraordinary profits. When we talk about an excess profit tax, this is part of what we're talking about. And it's one of the reasons why we think it is just and good to tax excess profits, because in some cases, those excess profits were a function of public spending, and it went to rich CEOs and their buddies and investors, and it shouldn't have. It never should have come out of the public purse for that purpose. That money was for companies to pass directly on to their employees in order to run their business as usual, not to make extraordinary profits. And in some cases that did happen. In many cases that happened. And that's good. And that's something that we called for. It's something that we supported. But what we didn't support, and what we from the beginning said the government needed to do, was to have a mechanism to make sure that it wasn't abused. No concern by the government there in order to get that piece of the puzzle right. And I would say no really proactive solutions proposed at the time by the Conservatives either in order to be able to make that happen. So certainly some frustration there. Another place where there was a lot of public spending public spending that pales, and like what was spent on CERB and the wage subsidy is as nothing compared to the liquidity that was made available to major banks on day one. That's an approach that was also taken in the 2008 recession, where liquidity by the Conservative government, incidentally, that the new leader of the Conservative Party sat at the cabinet table in, also granted a huge amount of liquidity to banks. And so if that made investors feel more bold, if it made banks willing to lend more, then I think there is a case to be made that that can have contributed to the acceleration of housing price increases that was already off the chain long before the pandemic. How did that happen? Well, to really understand what happened, and I know people don't always like a history lesson, but the fact is, going back to the mid-90s, when the Liberal government of the day cut the national housing strategy, like cut it, as in not reduced it, but got rid of it, that was producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000 units of affordable or social housing where rent is actually geared to income every year. That went on. It went on and on and on, and it meant that we didn't get any more meaningful injections of new affordable or social housing supply. It was left to the market. I mean, that's what happened in the 90s. So you hear the leader of the Conservative Party today say, let the free market reign and people will have housing. Like there's a bunch of developers just waiting to give housing to people who can't afford it. They're not going to do it now, but when the government gets out of the way, then developers will discover their generosity. I mean, it's such a ridiculous story. I don't even know how people can listen to it, let alone how much it gets repeated, not just in this place, but in the media and stuff like this, as if this is something that could possibly happen. The only time that we have made progress as a society successfully housing people that don't have the money to pay market rates to own their own home has been when there have been ambitious, targeted, non-market strategies led by government. And we have all benefited from those strategies. We've benefited by not having people live in our bus shelters. We've benefited by not having the effects of homelessness spill over into our emergency rooms and our prisons. And we've benefited by not having to pay the cost of having people so destitute that they have nowhere else to turn. That is why it's so important that government get back in the business of building housing. This isn't just about cities issuing permits to developers. There's such a need across an entire spectrum of types of housing that we absolutely need a plan, and we need non-market housing solutions, whether those are co-ops, whether those are government-owned and operated rent geared to income suites. We need to build far more housing. And of course, it wasn't just in the 90s that happened. The new leader of the Conservative Party was also part of the government that when all of the operating grants, so this is the money that the federal government gave to organizations that were running social housing, where people could pay rent that was a percentage of their income, usually between 25 and 30% of their income, whatever their income was. The federal government gave money to these organizations that for 40 years successfully ran those operations and housed people that never could have afforded to live in rental housing at market rates. When those came up, this very leader of the Conservative Party was at the table when that government decided not to renew those operating grants. And so what we've seen in the last 7 or more years now, because unfortunately this Liberal government, despite running on a promise to do something about this, never really did, we have seen these affordable units come up, and the buildings where the people who have been managing them for 40 years say we can't manage on the model that we used to because we don't have the operating grant anymore. That's how we could offer rent at below market rates. I mean, market rates are meant to cover costs and have some profit margin. If you want to have deeply affordable units that are actually geared to people's income, that money has to come from somewhere. And it came from those operating grants. Well, the Conservative government of the day, with a member of Carleton sitting at the table, decided that they would not renew those operating grants. So these buildings now are not sustainable, and they're going out on the market, and big developers are snatching them up. They're renovating the suites, and they're evicting the tenants that were there before because they're jacking up the rent. And that's how we end up with people camping out in bus shelters and setting up camp in parks. So I beseech Canadians who are outraged to see that, to carry that outrage past being mad about the problem. That's what the new leader of the Conservative Party is selling. He's selling a lot of rage. And you know what? Some of it is justified. I'm mad about a lot of things. But we are not going to fix those things unless we focus on the solutions. And trying to pretend that every problem somehow comes from government when there's clearly a whole lot of actors in the economy with real power and real self-interested motives is not someone that you can trust to fix the problem, because they're deliberately blind to part of the problem. Inflation is a great example, because there are studies out that show about 25% of the current inflation is actually attributable to increased profits, price gouging. It's going on. It's a real thing. You wouldn't know it to listen to the member for Carleton. You wouldn't know it to listen to this government, who also incidentally is not acting in the way they should. And it's why we've been pushing for them to take the tax that they've announced for banks and insurance companies on excess profits and apply that to oil and gas companies and big box stores and others that profited hugely during the pandemic and continue to make record profits despite the hardship that so many Canadians are facing. So doubling the GST tax credit is a way to try and get help to some of the people that really need it the most. We're talking about 12 million Canadians. That's a lot of people that receive the GST tax credit. They're going to see some kind of relief to help with these increases in costs. But it's not going to be enough on its own. And it should have come a lot sooner. I mean, this is something that New Democrats have been calling for well over 6 months as inflation began to really take hold. And we saw that it wasn't just going to go away. We wanted a way to get help to people. And we also wanted a way to get help to people in a way that wouldn't drive more inflation. And so the problem, again, with the new Conservative leader is that anytime you talk about having a plan to help people, he says that's just going to drive up inflation. And that's not true. There are certain ways the government could try to help and end up driving up inflation. But when you're serious about it and you look at what's actually going on in the economy, and you look at what the potential solutions are, there are ways, and doubling the GST tax credit is one of those ways. It's why New Democrats believe that this was an important immediate step that the government could take. Over 6 months later, here we are. They've finally seen reason, and I think accepted that there is a need for action. But as usual, it's a little slow, just as it was too slow for many seniors who were seeing their GIS clawed back because they had the audacity to accept the government at their word, to apply for the CERB program that they qualified for when they lost their job during the pandemic and needed that supplementary income, and then saw their incomes clawed back the following year. And you could see it from July of 2021 coming, or 2020, I should say. It was coming like a slow train wreck. And the government knew about it, and they didn't act on it. I think they knew as early as, I think it was May 2021. You'll forgive me if it's getting to be a little while ago, and a lot of water has passed under the bridge. But I believe that to be the case. And it wasn't until this year that they finally implemented a solution for that. And of course, we know, unfortunately, some seniors took their lives in the meantime because they couldn't see a future for themselves, because they couldn't contemplate pitching a tent in a park and living there in the winter in Winnipeg in January. And so this is a government that I think has been far too slow to act when it comes to helping people. But there are solutions if we're intentional. If we don't rule out the very real and positive role that the public sector can play, in not just in times of need, but also in structuring our economy so that we don't find ourselves in these kinds of crises, whether it's the housing crisis or other ones. Employment insurance is something I'd love to talk about. Perhaps I'll get a chance in the question and answer. The government's reverting back to the old EI system, even though that was always a disaster. And the new system has been working better, although not great. That's another place where the planning hasn't been put in place. Instead, we've actually got a lot of what the member Carleton calls for, which is a hands-off attitude from government and a pretty well letting the market reign when it comes to these things. And it's part of how we got to here. That's why we need a different approach. This is a small down payment. Let's get it done quickly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal Tar, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to ask a question and the excitement from the member from St. Catharines for wanting to hear my question. I listened intently to what the member was saying, in particular when he was talking about housing. And I know that a lot has been coming from the other side of the House, in particular when the Leader of the Opposition talks about gatekeepers. He seems to focus a lot on these gatekeepers at the municipal level that are preventing development from happening, as if that is the golden ticket to the housing crisis that we have now. I don't believe that it is. I'm curious if he can comment on that, but I also would like to hear his thoughts on cooperative housing. I know that he mentioned that in his speech, and he offered it as one solution. It's a solution that at least I've seen in my riding can be very effective at getting tenants and those who are in the cooperative to genuinely participate in the organization, and it becomes a sense of pride and ownership in participating in that. And I'm wondering if he can comment on whether or not that's his preferred model of affordable housing when it's being built, or if he envisions something different.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I thank the member very much for his question, and of course, I think one of the points that I was trying to make, and I hope came across, was that the member of Carleton has been a gatekeeper himself, and when an important decision came about maintaining affordable housing and social housing and continuing to make that available for people who need it, who otherwise are on the street, he chose to cut government funding to those very housing projects and allow big economic players in to swoop in, buy those units, renovate and evict or renovict those tenants, jack up the rent, and make a killing. And that is part of the culture that has only accelerated in the pandemic years. But we know what this guy is like. We saw what he did when he had his hand on the lever. He decided to let those big players in to essentially dine out on the housing that had been built in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and make huge profits instead of preserving that housing for the people it was built for, who actually needed it. I'd be happy to talk a little bit about cooperative housing another time. I see the speaker's anxious to get to the next question.
Just me being the keeper of the gate. The Honourable Member for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry with the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to say I am so grateful for that very insightful speech from the member of the NDP. And here's why. They are as excited to talk about our new Conservative leader than they are about anything else, including their relationship with the Liberal government. And I think I know why. We're back from a summer around the riding, and I think folks in Elmwood, Transcona, I think people in Timmins, I think people on Vancouver Island sent those members a little message this summer that they don't like this relationship they have with this Liberal government. Their policies are driving inflation, and what we are continuing to see is the same thing. So if he wants to talk about the new Conservative leader, I'm happy to do so as well. The question for him to put on the record then is our clear message this week. Payroll taxes are going to be going up, taking more off people's paychecks January 1st. The carbon tax is going up April 1st and is scheduled to triple. If he wants to control inflation, if he wants to help people with their financial budgets, does he agree with us? No new tax increases.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood, Transcona.
I am excited to talk about the new Conservative leader because I think as people get to know him, they will come to feel about him as I do. And I think a clue was in the member's question, actually, when he talked about payroll taxes. What Canadians should know is that when he says payroll tax, what he means is your pension. That's what he means. When we're talking about increases to the Canada Pension Plan so that Canadians can have a decent retirement, they call it a payroll tax. People should know that somebody that thinks that their pension is a payroll tax instead of what you go to work and actually work for and expect to bank on in your retirement is someone who is not in your corner and cannot be trusted to manage the affairs of the country. That's what people should know. And that's why I will keep talking about the new leader of the Conservative Party until everybody in Canada knows it.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to first of all thank my colleague for his speech. I would like to hear what he has to say on the following matter. The government's nasty habit. When they implement a policy, they systematically forget to think about Quebec. I would like to have his opinion on how a government can claim to govern all of Canada whilst forgetting 23% of the population. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kona. That is an excellent question, and I believe that another point that highlights this is the big question of OAS. For seniors, an OAS increase is very important, especially in these difficult times. It's important for them to have their OAS, their fixed pension, increased, and we have a government that seems to believe that the real price crunch on people's budgets and seniors' budgets is only applicable to seniors over 75 years of age. And we know, like the members from the Bloc, that this is not true. All seniors in the country, in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada, are under these extreme pressures, and there must be an across-the-board increase of the OAS applicable to all seniors. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for what I think is a very good speech. It's a very good moment for New Democrats when we can finally talk about the issues that most Canadians are already experiencing right at the pumps or in the grocery stores, and that's corporate greed. I heard the member just speak just a bit about that, which I'd like the member to elaborate on, but here's some facts. Pasta, 30% increase, coffee, 20%, oranges, 16%, bread, 16%. Another number, $3.5 billion of profit by big grocery stores. We're the only party talking about the real cost of inflation, which is corporate greed. Would the member please elaborate on how this corporate greed cost is affecting Canadians in his riding?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much to the member for Edmonton-Griesbach for that question. $3.5 billion, and that's money that comes out of the pockets of Canadians, just as any tax paid to the government comes out of the pockets of Canadians. And so when we see that kind of extraordinary increase in profit that goes hand in hand with price increases, then you have to know that a significant amount of that price increase is not just to make up for increased supply costs, but in fact is a company taking advantage of a difficult situation in order to charge more for their product. And they're able to walk away with more of that profit because since the year 2000, the corporate income tax in Canada has dropped from 28% down to 15%. We've seen like another way that the Harper government, among others, have contributed to the real estate culture that is driving housing prices through the roof was by not doing anything about the capital gains exemption that stands at 50%, which allows people to sell not just their stocks, but also real estate beyond their primary residence and get a steep tax discount for doing their business with stocks and real estate instead of income like most Canadians receive when they go to work. They get a salary or an hourly wage. Well, if you're fortunate enough to be dealing in real estate or in stocks, you actually get to pay 50% less tax, period, just by virtue of the way you do your own business. And all of that has reduced government revenue, not just absolutely, but as a share of GDP between 2000 and now. And that's why we don't have the money we need in order to fund proper public services.
And comments. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague from Elmwood-Transcona. I appreciated his focus on the excess profits of the oil and gas sector. I don't like using the term excess profit. I don't like using windfall profit. Let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about immoral war profiteering. That's what we're seeing right now. And if the honourable members across the way want to laugh, let me refer to the business columnist in the Globe and Mail, Eric Reguly, who called this out on his August 8th column and pointed out the profits of oil and gas right now have nothing to do with business acumen and everything to do with war. And I'd like to ask my honourable colleague if he agrees with the Parliamentary Budget Office that by doubling from 15% to 30%, that additional $8 billion coming into the Canadian economy to government coffers could help us take care of the poorest of the poor.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona with a very quick answer.
Yes, I absolutely believe that additional profit that those companies are making, as the member says, not because of their business acumen, but by taking advantage of global circumstances in order to have a fig leaf as an excuse for why they're raising prices, absolutely should be taken back and should be invested in the things that we need in order to succeed as a society. Those are, that we need housing, we need better health care, we need to tackle the climate crisis. We can create jobs, good jobs for people by doing that. And we need money to pay for this. The money is out there. Government collects a lot less in relative terms than it used to, even just 20 years ago. And it's time we start going back after that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.